All right, everyone, we're back for part 2 of lecture. So the first term that we're going to learn today is texture. Texture. Texture refers to the number of independent layers that are ongoing in a piece of music at a given time. It kind of refers to density, like the kind of roles in which each instrument or each vocal line is playing sort of according to the piece or the composition that you're listening to. Texture happens in sort of 4 different realms that vary from simplest to most complicated. At this point, it's probably going to be really helpful for me to go to a whiteboard and to kind of draw out some of the things that I'm talking about. Before I do so, texture happens on a sliding scale, though. Something could be more texturally complicated than another listening example, but usually points of comparison are somewhat important in trying to assess what's texturally happening in a piece of music. And a lot of these definitions that I go over are going to make a lot more sense when I actually illustrate them with a musical example. So we're going to talk about some terms and some definitions first, and then illustrate these 4 different textural kind of areas with different listening examples. So let me go ahead and toggle over to my whiteboard. Okay, here's my whiteboard, which would look very similar if we were, in class right now. So texture. Texture refers to the number of different layers going on during a piece of music. Like I said, this relates to the idea of density. So this idea of density, we can have a piece of music that is not particularly dense, or we can have a piece of music that is incredibly dense. So what do I mean by density? Like I said, each instrument kind of fulfills a different role, or each vocal line fulfills a different role within a musical composition. One of the most simple textures that, and we're gonna make a little bit of a line graph. This is our simple side, and here is our complex side. Our most simple texture that we encounter in music is something called monophonic texture. Monophonic, mono meaning one, phonic, voice. So where we have, quite simply, if we were to take this literally, just one person doing the musical activity. So example, like if you like solo singing in the shower. So in the morning when you are, doing your routine and you are singing to yourself in the shower, you are monophonic. You are one singular voice that is creating the musical activity. There's only one layer that's happening at that point. You can have everyone participate in one layer of musical activity, though. So our secondary example, where we have multiple people, for example, everyone like sort of sing, speaking, I pledge allegiance. So hopefully you have at some point put your hand across your heart and stood towards the flag, and in a large group of people in unison said, "I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America." So that is also monophonic, where everyone is doing the same thing at the same time. So this is our simplest texture. Our next most complicated texture that we encounter in music is something we call homophonic texture. This is for the most part, a very simple equation. It's melody, the thing that is of primary interest, over accompaniment. Some sort of support for the melody. Usually melody, especially when we're thinking about a song, is usually like the vocal part. Versus the accompaniment, which is usually the instruments backing up the vocalist. The instruments can, of course, be greatly varied. It could be, you know, piano or piano and drums or piano, drums and bass or any number of combinations of things. But the whole idea is that you're either in this group, group A, the melody, or group B, the accompaniment, the thing that supports the melody. When we're thinking about a visual representation of homophonic texture often looks like a portrait or portraiture or a selfie, where you have one subject, which is most important. Please enjoy my stick figure right there. And then you have like something that's in the background, like a terrible house, that supports this, this main thing. This is our subject, and in a piece of music, which is usually going to be something we call the melody. All right. Most of the music that we listen to falls in this texture. Like 90% of what we listen to. That's not like a value judgment, and that's not to say that when we're listening to a piece of homophonic music that it doesn't move occasionally to monophonic texture or the other more complicated textures that I've yet to reveal to you. But for the most part, we like this as an idea where we're looking at one subject, again, and then everything supports that subject. So most of what you listen to, like the most, like if it's certainly within popular music and it's being played on the radio, it is probably falling into homophonic texture. There are two more complicated textures than homophonic texture, which by the way is a huge jump from monophonic texture. The next most complicated one is something we call heterophonic. And the most complicated texture we have is something we call polyphonic. I'm going to get back to heterophonic, but first I want to talk about polyphonic, the most complicated. Polyphonic means many voices. More specifically than many voices, it really means many melodies. This is where you have more than one melody ongoing at a time. A great example of this is like you're at a party and two or more people are trying to have conversations with you. At the same time. I hope you guys can all read my writing. I'm trying to be speedy, but also clear. So hopefully you've all been at a party before, especially before lockdown and such, where you're in a rich social environment and everyone is talking about different things. Like people are trying to have different conversations with you at a given moment. Specifically when people are trying to have different conversations with you, they're there are two kinds of varieties of polyphony. We have non-imitative polyphony and imitative polyphony. And I'll go ahead and put that in a different color. Here we go. Imitative and non-imitative. Imitative is when obviously the melodies or the different conversations have something to do with one another. Maybe you're in a grand group of people and everyone is talking about what they're going to be doing for spring break or summer vacation or what's going to, a winter vacation, whatever it might be, but like vacations of some sort. But everyone is having some sort of conversation that relates to different vacations. That's going to be like a point of imitation. If it were non-imitative, perhaps everyone would be talking about totally different things. Someone's talking about their pet, someone's talking about their vacation, another person is talking about what they wore to, some snazzy party last week. Who knows? But that's non-imitative, where the conversations or the ideas don't have anything to do with one another. Very, very little of the music like that we listen to falls within this category. There will be moments of polyphony that we encounter, and if we do listen to polyphony in a musical context, more often than not, we're going to listen to imitative polyphony, where the ideas have something to do with one another versus non-imitative polyphony. But like, this is rare, happens sometimes. Or like very little within a piece of music. The next most complicated texture that, in between homophonic texture and polyphonic texture, we have heterophonic texture. And this is a little bit of a nebulous area, like where homophonic texture begins and heterophonic texture or where homophonic texture ends and heterophonic texture begins, and where heterophonic texture ends and polyphony begins is a little bit of a gray area. So the thing with heterophonic texture is it's usually melody as a call that's answered with a melody that's a response that's all over accompaniment. The reason that I left heterophonic to the end is because it's a little bit harder to define. In general, heterophonic texture feels like a game of Marco, and hopefully you just answered Polo. So there's a kind of call and response relationship between two instruments or an instrumentalist and a vocalist, or two different vocalists, or even within just one instrument. But there's like a kind of call and response element, or a Marco Polo kind of feel. Most of what we listen to, like I said, falls into homophonic texture in this bubble, but starts to incorporate some of heterophonic texture as well. So the majority of what we listen to, like I said, falls in that kind of pink dotted bubble that I just put overlaid onto our graph kind of. So texture, this is again, left-hand side, we go from simple to right-hand side, more complicated. Awesome. That's a lot to take in. The thing that you should try to be comfortable with at this point is the idea that we do move from simple to complicated, and that we have 4 categories that refer to the kind of density of musical material that we're listening to at a given time. A piece might start out monophonic and then move to homophonic and then move to heterophonic and then back to homophonic. But when we're trying to assess what texture we're listening to, it's important to figure out, like, proportionally, what amount of time do we spend in a particular area. All right, I'm going to stop our share. All of these, by the way, are available for you to look at in either Blackboard or Dropbox, the slides, that is. So these definitions are great. They're going to mean something to us when we actually apply it to a piece of music that we're listening to. So I've picked a handful and a half of listening examples from the 1970s, which is the golden age of vinyl. There are so many different and interesting things that are happening within musical genres in the 1970s. Certainly, we have a huge importance on disco that happens in the 1970s, dance music, and a lot of it's an idea of what I call like the medium impacting the message. So vinyl was hot off the presses and was becoming significantly more popular. We have the idea of artists coming out with albums with a very specific side A and side B component to them. But more than necessarily like how these pieces are woven into the cultural context of the 1970s, I want to go through some of these listening examples and figure out what's happening to them texturally. So the third part of our video, I'm going to go through the listening examples and play very little of them, mostly so that I can keep them within this video so that I can lecture about them without you having to toggle back and forth between the playlist and my video. However, what you really will need to do is listen to the playlist in full. As a reminder, there are links that are also a part of this video, but they're also in a link list that's posted online for your easy access. So what I'm going to do is for the 8 to 10 listening examples that we're going to go through, I'm going to pull up a new whiteboard. I'm going to wipe our whiteboard clean and draw a line that maps our texture from simplest texture to most complicated texture. And we're going to assess each of these listening examples based on how complicated they feel. Before you press on to the third part of this, make sure that on a piece of paper, you have done the following. Written out a definition of texture for yourself that works for you. Then a definition of the 4 textures that we encounter in music, and arrange them from most simple to most complicated. You're also going to want to write a line to sort of compare and contrast the listening examples that we go through in the next segment as well. So you can prepare that on a piece of paper if you need to, which again, I would really encourage you to do so. So I will see you guys for part 3, review part 2 as you need before proceeding.